Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, good night. It is 5:30 Eastern time. So it's afternoon and nighttime for some. My name is Shaliza here at Nisa Helpline, and we are very excited to start this session tonight with you. I have with me some esteemed guests, and we have tonight a really in-depth discussion that we are going to kick off. So let's get right into it. Our theme this month, so if you've been following us this month, you would have seen quite a lot of content, a lot of discussions on our page about violence against women. We've done, last week, earlier this weekend, actually, we did conjugal violence, and there's lots of discussion about the violence that Muslim women face within marriages. Tonight, we're going to take a different angle. We're going to talk a little bit about Islamophobia. Islamophobia, quoted from Sidra Ahmed's paper on Islamophobia, she writes, Islamophobia also operates along gendered lines. Through gendered Islamophobia, Muslim women are constructed in the following ways: as victims of their religion and of uncivilized Muslim men, as exotic and hypersexualized, as in the image of the haram girl, as weak and passive women who need to be rescued, presumably by Western powers of colonial intervention, and being affiliated with terrorism by default. So, that's one scope on what Islamophobia is. Very, very strong words used there. And what we're hoping to do tonight is really go into a discussion on the impact of Islamophobia directly on mental health and our women. So we're going to get right in. My name is Shaliza, like I said, and I have with me tonight Dr. Rania Awaad. Dr. Rania is a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine, where she is the chief of the diversity section, associate chief of the Division of Public Mental Health and Population Sciences, and the director of Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab. She is also the clinical director of the San Francisco Bay Area branches of the Khalil Center, a spiritual wellness center pioneering the application of traditional Islamic spiritual healing methods to modern clinical psychology. Prior to studying medicine, she pursued classical Islamic studies in Damascus, Syria, and holds certifications in Quran, Islamic law, and other branches of the Islamic sciences. In addition, she serves as the director of the Rahma Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to educating Muslim women and girls. Dr. Awaad is a nationally recognized speaker, award-winning teacher, researcher, and author in both Islamic and medical sciences. Welcome, Dr. Awaad. We also have with us Aasiyah Khan from the National Council of Canadian Muslims. Aasiyah is the Education and Outreach Coordinator. The National Council of Canadian Muslims is an independent, nonpartisan, and non-profit organization that protects Canadian human rights and civil liberties, challenges discrimination and Islamophobia, builds mutual understanding, and advocates for the public concerns of Canadian Muslims. In Aasiyah's role as the Education and Outreach Coordinator with the National Council of Canadian Muslims, she develops and leads training programs nationally on a range of topics, including anti-Islamophobia, anti-discrimination, human rights, and allyship. So tonight, inshallah, I have these two amazing ladies with me, and I really want to get into the discussion about Islamophobia and its impact on Muslim women. And again, we are looking to have this discussion in line with our theme this month, which is violence against women. So I'm going to ask the first question to Aasiyah. So Nisa Helpline is based in Canada, and we support North American women. So firstly, Aasiyah, we're hoping that you can give us the reality of the situation here in Canada. Tell us what Islamophobic events and what the situation is right now in Canada.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It's a pleasure to kind of share the space with Dr. Awaad and Shaliza. It's a really important question because I think we're noticing the ways in which Islamophobia is showing up in a number of ways within our communities. So, you know, with my experience working in the school system, I work very closely with school boards across the country. And we are finding that, you know, young Muslim women are having to really think a lot about their identities. It's constantly under kind of a microscope. We recently did a town hall where we actually got young Muslims to kind of come and just share their experiences being a young student right now within education. And we noted that, so specifically young hijabi girls, they shared that, you know, in their transition from going to grade 8 to high school, many of them noted that, you know, we're making a conscious decision to actually remove our hijabs. And so as I kind of, you know, chatted with them and talked a little bit more about it, they noted it wasn't that they didn't like wearing the hijab or something was inherently wrong with the hijab itself. It was the discourse around their identity, the misconceptions, the judgment. And so they noted, as they were kind of making that transition to high school, they didn't want to deal with that extra kind of burden, right? And so we're finding that our young Muslim youth, young Muslim women specifically, are bearing quite a burden when it comes to kind of the discourse around Islam and Muslims, and even just kind of outside of, you know, educational spaces, even in the community. Like a study was recently done that noted that, you know, when we're looking at the experiences of Islamophobia, there's two areas where we're finding it occur the most. So that's in public spaces, so public transit, you're visiting the park, you're going for a walk, or in kind of employment, right? So places where you're working. So it could be something like you're asking for an accommodation and you're constantly finding that you're having to jump through extra hoops, whereas your other kind of colleagues aren't. You're being passed off for promotions, etc. And so we're finding that, you know, Muslim women specifically, because of the gendered implications of Islamophobia, are bearing the brunt of a lot of the kind of Islamophobic violence that we see, unfortunately.
Thank you for that, Aasiyah. You know, and I think, you know, something that, you know, we talk a lot about in our spiritual circles, in our masjids. You know, we speak about identity, and, you know, I have 3 sons and they walk out the house and nobody can tell if they're Muslim, right? Because, you know, we live in Canada and it's a pretty uniform North American form of dress. But when I step out, the first thing that people see is my identity, is who I am, is that association with my faith. And, you know, I started off quoting Sidra Ahmed's paper, and then the one piece that, you know, she mentioned as well in her paper is that it is associated with being affiliated with terrorism. And then, you know, what we've seen over the last little while is a rise in events. So we've seen, you know, a significant rise in events out in France. We've seen, you know, the US, there's always, you know, it's constant, and then it's growing more out here in Canada as well, where we have seen a rise of events where Muslims are targeted, and then Muslims who wear hijab like ourselves may feel more uneasy about who we are and how we show up. So I'm really gonna pass it off to Dr. Rania, and I'm hoping that you can share with us, Dr. Rania, how help us understand. I think the question is, help us understand how all of this affects our mental health, so that of ourselves as Muslim women and young girls growing up, making the decisions to wear hijab or to not, but really to identify with their faith.
Absolutely. And first, thank you for having me here and for the Nisa Helpline and all the good work and wonderful things that you all are up to. And thank you, Shaliza and Aasiyah, for your comments so far. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam ajma'in. Absolutely. This topic of Islamophobia is, and I'll probably get to this a little bit later, not only does it affect the Muslim community, but it affects really any communities that are marginalized, communities that are, really, by marginalized, we mean kind of, you know, pushed to the margins because of their identity. And in our case, actually, we would say even multiple identities that we hold. So for many, Muslims, not only are they, is Islam a target, but also the fact, and here we're talking about women, so gender is a factor as well. But if you add on top of that as well, that many are also immigrants, and immigrants have received quite a bad rep, unfortunately, and a lot of targeting as well in this era that we're in. And other things as well, communities of color. I mean, there's so many layers that you're going to add one over another to get us to where we are today and why we feel the way we feel today. So when you ask about what is the effect that this kind of Islamophobia is having on the mental health of the community, in many ways, Muslims will tell you it's obvious, right? It's kind of a clear connection. But interestingly, in the literature, there hasn't been a whole lot of connection on this. In fact, this is why my team and I, a group of us, have taken a couple of years ago, took on a project of really publishing the first study and in fact what became a book that's now called Islamophobia Psychiatry, that traces the direct effect of Islamophobia to the detrimental mental health effects on the community. And what we found very clearly is that, as you look to all the studies and all the research and the many, many different chapters that are in that book, the theme is the same over and over again. You put elements of marginalization along with faith-specific discrimination. The people who are, otherwise, like you mentioned, Muslim women who are wearing hijab are the symbol of Islam. That's the first person you think of, or the first type of people you think of when you think Muslim, is the hijabi woman, right? So the most obvious emblems of the faith, right, are going to be the most directly targeted. And as an effect, then the domino effect of that is that then you have girls, like you're mentioning, that Aasiyah was mentioning, are questioning and saying, we don't have anything, there's nothing with the hijab itself that we're concerned about in this group of people she was interviewing, but it's the fact that I will be targeted. Everyone is going to not just look at me, but I also fear for safety, right? So that level of being in threat or lack of safety or fear absolutely exacerbates anything that even at baseline was a mental health condition. If somebody already at baseline was a bit anxious, or at baseline already had some difficult family circumstances, now you're just adding layers of difficulty to that. So, we can definitely speak more about, what happens now with how do you work with all of this mental health wise, but really in nutshell, Islamophobia is so harmful in, exacerbating the mental health issues in our community already.
Thank you, Dr. Rania. What I hear really loud and clear is one, that it's not up for discussion in that, does it affect our mental health? Yes. What I also heard really clearly as well is the term that you used, and you said that, the hijab is the emblem, right? So, when I think about that, I really think about the weight of the decision of wearing hijab in a Western country, right? So, when you're walking outside, you're walking outside wearing the emblem, and not everybody is going to have the same experiences when they see that emblem. So, I would look at, we know that we've heard words like the Muslim ban being used. We've heard there's a lot of propaganda that goes out there, and what to us may seem as an act of faith, to others is looked at as an act of terrorism, right? So, it's definitely a difficult struggle. And I think that's where, I'm going to really focus on for my next question is, what does this spiritual struggle look like when we do begin to equate our physical identities as a safety concern? So when I walk out and I look at myself in the mirror and I go outside and I'm like, I look nice, but I'm also a little bit concerned. Or if I chose to wear a black top and a black scarf and I'm like, oh, I look too much like a terrorist today. Even I start thinking like that. Maybe I should switch up the colors a little bit more. Right. So when I start and when I can go through even with my own experiences to how I got there, I remember there was a time where I would have loved to wear black all the time. Right. It was my go-to. But then I may have switched up a little bit, not realizing that, well, actually, I think intentionally switching up a little bit, saying, I don't think this is the right choice of outfit. Maybe do a color here and a color there so that it's not as scary to other people. Right. And I think I think that's where I really want to, what does that look like in terms of mental health? Help us understand what that experience does
Yeah,
and how we
absolutely.
go through that.
Absolutely, Shalizad. I would say I'm in the same boat. You will almost never catch me wearing black on black completely, black scarf and black outfit, and for that very reason. And it is quite intentional, and it's very difficult. And I'll tell you more. It's not just how will others who are not Muslim perceive me, and how they may discriminate against me and have any sort of Islamophobic attack on me, or even just stare me down, even if they said nothing at all. And to that point, before I say what I'm going to say, we have found in the studies and literature related to Islamophobia that Muslims report a whole lot more, subtle forms of Islamophobia directed at them than overt. Every so often you receive, you hear the stories of, somebody was attacked and somebody on the subway and somebody's scarf was pulled and a terrible thing has happened to them. Overt forms of Islamophobia. For many, it's actually a whole lot more subtle. It's something that is said and it's not very clear. There's that kind of that like, you really need to figure out what was that bias statement that was made, right? And then there's the people just sort of giving you the dirty looks, so to say. So that is what happens in terms of perception for people who may be not Muslim. But interestingly enough, the term internalized stigma is something we need to also know as a community, because as a Muslim community, we have developed internalized stigma, which basically is we ourselves start to believe that this is what a terrorist, let's say, looks like, and therefore I'm going to avoid looking anything similar to that. So whether it's the woman not wearing black on black, even though I can't even tell you how that connection necessarily even makes sense per se, right? Or men not wanting to wear their beards or grow a longer beard or anything of this nature, wear a turban, something of that effect, right? So again, media portrayals. So when you look at that, and I'll give you a short example. I was one time in my clinic and I went to, and I had a woman who was in full niqab, so wearing essentially black and black all the way through her full black khimar. Finished a session, I walked her out of the clinic in order to then, in the waiting room, receive the next patient. And the next patient, who was also Muslim, right, came into my room, it came into the room and was shaking, totally shaking like a leaf, and I said, are you okay? Thinking something in her life had happened. And she said, why does that woman have to dress that way? And we had this whole discussion kind of, processing through all these emotions she was having, including actual intense fear. And at the end of that whole discussion, she said, wow, the media has really done a number on me. I cannot believe that I have had this level of a reaction against my own Muslim sister who chooses, right, to wear niqab, and this particular woman chose. I mean, nobody asked her to do so. She chose this form of dress. So it's just, it tells you psychologically where we're at as a community as well.
Yeah, and I hear you use the term, and to be quite candid, I've never used that term before when it comes to myself. So, I heard you say internalized stigma.
Yes, internalized.
Yes. Okay, good. I'm learning tonight. So internalized stigma, but you know what really resonates there with me is that it's on ourselves, like we're doing this to ourselves. We're the people, our surroundings, there's impact there as well. And then within our own community, because we too are bombarded with so much propaganda that it's almost like an infection, right? I'm too infected. When I made that decision to say black on black, not right, it is there doing the job of propaganda, right? So it does seem to me that there's a lot of education that has to happen, not just with our external communities, but within our internal communities as well, among ourselves, to understand how this is impacting us. And really to learn how to deal with it, right? To learn how to navigate these conversations in this new reality.
Absolutely, 100%. 100%. And you've also mentioned, is there, beyond psychological and mental health, you also mentioned the word spiritual, like where are we with this spiritually speaking, and how are we coping, if you will, with all of this? But first, before we go there, and maybe here I'll share another story that maybe many can relate to, but I would say that even when we have essentially successes of some sort in the Muslim community, and I'll tell you what I mean. The portrayal of Muslims in the media often is unwanted, unwarranted, right? Often is very negative. Every so often, though, there are positive portrayals. And actually, nowadays, we're seeing this much, much more with commercials having Muslim women in hijab and ads having Muslim women in hijab and so on and so forth, where you're starting to see yourself essentially in those portrayals and thinking, okay, I'm not as, I'm more a fabric of the society than I had been previously, right? So that is positive. But even with the positive sometimes comes a whole lot of difficulty. And I'll give you my own personal example. I've shared this with others before. It's, in 2018, Mattel, who owns Barbie, released, of course, the first hijabi Barbie in the, representing Ibtihaj Muhammad, who is a wonderful delight, and a woman who is, of course, the first hijabi woman to represent the United States in the Olympics. And not only that, but she actually, who wears hijab. And not only that, but then she also won a medal. And so she brought her family and country a whole lot of honor and, really lifted everyone's head. And Barbie chose their Sheroes line to represent her. So she broke all kinds of barriers in her personal life, of course, but even with this Barbie, we have all these barriers broken as the first, hijabi Barbie. And when this came out, when the first, ad, I remember scrolling through my feed and I saw this, and it was almost like a shock, because being a kid who grew up playing Barbies, as I'm sure everyone here was as well, potentially, right? And I have stories of my mother telling me, that I fashioned my own little hijabs to go on my Barbie dolls, right? So this was like a really neat thing to see. And now comes my own daughter, who is, at the time of this story, is about 10, coming over my shoulder. She sees I'm really excited by something I'm looking at. What is it, Mom? What is it, Mom? And so I turn to show her, what this is. And she's like, oh, amazed and very happy and excited. And, and she even says, is this real? Is this real? She just can't believe herself. And as I'm looking through, I'm saying, yeah, it looks very real to me. And as we're scrolling through and she's still peering over my shoulder, comes the comments section. And in the comments section, there's a picture of another Barbie doll that has its eye blackened out and all kind of, disheveled, right? And looks like the comment actually says, if Mattel wants to take on representing a Muslim woman, this is what it actually should look like, the oppressed Muslim woman, right? And in that moment, right, here I have this 10-year-old who's so excited about this great, presentation. And I have a decision as a mother to make. Do I turn the screen and say, oh, no, nothing, which is actually what I did. What is it, Mom? Nothing, or do I actually, burst her bubble as a child and say to her, this is the reality of what Muslim women and Muslims face in this country. So I think that's, kind of starts to tell us exactly where we are in the decisions we make as a mother, as a parent, knowing that the stats say that 1 in every 2 Muslim children are going to be bullied for their faith, their background as a Muslim, for their faith, either their Muslim name, their Muslim dress, what they eat, even whatever they look like and say, compared, and that is so much more compared to the next faith groups over. As a parent, when I send my kid out there, there is that real thought in my head of like, what will happen here, to this child, and what kind of responsibilities do I have? So kind of just sharing that kind of spiritual, psychological struggles that I think a lot are going through in carrying the tenets of their deen, but balancing that with some of the realities out there.
Yeah, and you know what? You bring a really That really strikes me too, because even in our wins, we can't be naive to the realities. Um, and that's something that I think is, as much as I too get excited every time I look, oh, there's a hijabi on the bank's ad, right? We've never seen this. But sharing that story really reinforces that we can't be naive to our reality, even as we win, right? It is struggle continues, and that is the reality that we're in right now. And that really brings me to my next question that I'm going to direct to Aasiyah. So, we talk a little bit just now about the reality that we are in, and that though we have seen so many positives and so much progress, we don't want to shy away from what the reality is. Um, and I'm really looking to you to shed some light on what should one do if one of us are faced with verbal or physical acts of Islamophobic violence. What are our rights of what are our rights? What should we be aware of? I'm going to give you a specific example simply because this one was used quite a lot within the helpline as we've shared, and we've received calls about this as well. In particular, racial slurs in the subway. A lot of, I'm in public transit and I'm being called or being pushed in the subway spaces like that. When things like that happen, what are some things that we should be aware of?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important question because at NCCM, like I said, we have, we're a human rights organization, as you noted, Shaliza, and so we do have an active human rights department, and we do get a lot of calls around kind of what are my rights, what can I do in a particular situation. Unfortunately, we have heard, numerous times where women are feeling really unsafe, specifically within public transit, be it the subway, on a bus, etc. And I think it kind of, goes back to a lot of what we've been talking about around kind of just the general climate that we're kind of navigating, right? As Muslims, as well as kind of even other folks, right, of different backgrounds, different equity-seeking groups, kind of the way our current climate is right now, there's a sense of kind of intolerance and a lot of hate, right? And so I think when it comes to kind of what we can do, I think that's a really important question because it's very easy for us to kind of feel like, things are hopeless, right? Things are not going so well. How do I, as a Muslim woman, navigate these spaces? There was an interesting study in 2017 that noted in Canada that, like 46% of Canadians have an unfavorable view of Islam, right? And that's more than for any other faith tradition. And so there is this kind of stereotype here that, all Canadians are polite, we're really nice. Well, that might be the case. There is a lot of Islamophobia that folks are experiencing, right, in multiple forms. And when you bring up the subway incident, I remember being a student myself. I had to take the subway. And I remember that was kind of when I started wearing the hijab myself. And so I was very mindful of being a visibly Muslim woman. And there was a certain time period during my kind of schooling where there was a string of incidents where women were actually, they're essentially being pushed onto the tracks. And so I remember, waiting for the subway and being so mindful of my body language, where I was standing. I remember, kind of having my backpack and my back against the wall and waiting for the subway train to open up. I would just run in and kind of just always kind of live with that kind of in everything I did, right? And I think even though we might not experience it in these explicit ways or directly, kind of just that the way it impacts our day-to-day, the decisions we're making. I know a lot of women who say, I don't leave my house without my phone, not because, I want to be on, my Insta, I want to be on Facebook. It's because it's like my security blanket, right? It's my safety, right? In case something happens, I want to be able to document something. And so what we remind folks of is to, of course, right, your safety is number one. If you find that your safety is being, your safety is at risk, definitely try to reach out for help from those around you, right? Try to get some help. You want to document as much as you can. So like I said, a lot of us have phones, right? So if you do choose to kind of press charges or go forward with a case, we ask that you document as much as you can. So it could be photographs, it could be videos, it could be, you know, noting who's around, who's witnessed stuff, get their information. And then obviously, you know, do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Like it's experiencing an Islamophobic incident is very traumatic, right? And often a lot of us say, you got to do this, this is the right way to do things. And to be honest, like sometimes you just need a moment to just process, right? And so I think that's where having, you know, allies and folks who are, you know, empowered bystanders to actually kind of take the lead, right? Because oftentimes for someone who's experiencing it, it's very difficult emotionally, psychologically, to kind of engage in all of these things, right? And so if you are someone who's witnessing, or you are in a space where you're noticing something could potentially go, you know, become dangerous or potentially harmful, ensure that we're kind of taking the steps. Like at NCCM, we encourage folks to do like 6 Ds of intervention. And so that's, you know, discover, right? Figure out what's going on, be mindful of your surroundings, right? So if you're in a TTC, if you're in certain spaces, be mindful of what's going on. And if you are comfortable, you can even use different interventions like distraction, right? So if you notice a Muslim woman is being targeted, a conversation is happening and it doesn't seem like it's going, you know, it's kind of turning a leaf that might potentially go awry or become violent, you can use distraction, right? You can walk up to the Muslim woman, you can act like you know her, you can try to physically remove her from that space. You can even be very direct, right? And again, your safety is number one. I would use this with caution, but you can directly tell the person who's engaging in, you know, the Islamophobic discourse or actions, you can let them know that what they're doing is wrong. Delegate tasks, right? So like I said, if you're in a stressful situation and you're the victim, it's very difficult to kind of engage and try to think about what to do. So if you're someone who's watching this happen, delegate tasks, right? Get someone to call for help, get someone to document. Someone should actually be with the, you know, the sister who's being targeted. And then of course, you know, delay. You might want to wait until the situation has wound down and approach, you know, the person being targeted and ask, you know, what is it that they need? Sometimes we try to swoop in and try to do what we think is best, but it's really important that we allow the person being targeted to define what support looks like for them. And so there's so many ways that intervention can take place. But I think it's really important for folks who are witnessing it, right, or who are in those spaces to actually also step up and feel like they also have a responsibility to ensure that Muslim women are safe, right, and they're not navigating these environments with kind of this added pressure on them, which many of them certainly are. So there's a lot we can do.
Aasiyah, thanks so much for that. Let's recap. What's the 4 Ds? I just want to make sure I got it right.
Yeah, so there's 6 Ds.
6.
First one is discover. So figure out what's going on. You can distract, right? So you can kind of get in there, use some distraction methods. Be direct, again, with caution. So your safety is number one. Delegate, so get everyone in the environment to get involved and to kind of support and help. Document, so again, your phone is a handy way to document things. And the final one is delay. So you might want to wait till things have wound down for you to kind of approach and see what support looks like for the person being targeted.
Perfect. Very tactical. I like that. Aasiyah, I have another question for you. And this one really goes back to our perceptions about what are our rights in Canada to wear hijab. And, you know, when I think about this, you know, in our conversations, there's so many sisters that come here from, you know, so many different countries of the world. And then a lot of us are confused, like, are we allowed to wear hijab? Are we allowed to go into interview? When we get that interview, should we ask if we're allowed to come in with hijab? I know a few girls who've actually told me that they've asked permission to come to the interview with hijab. So, you know, I think what we're also hoping that you can share some light with is what are our rights here in Canada as it relates to hijab?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, you know, obviously with a lot of the discourse around the hijab, the visibility of the hijab, sometimes we have a lot of questions about it, right? And I think it's important for us to know that according to the Canadian human rights legislation, you know, your religion is one of those protected grounds. So it's illegal to discriminate against someone based on their religion, such as even just their race, their sex, their ethnic origin, etc. Right? So there's a number of protected grounds, and your religion is one of them. So if hijab is an important part of your religious practice, you have the right to wear the hijab. So when it comes to workplaces, we've had incidents where Muslim women had phone interviews, right? And the interview was great. They got called in for a second one, and this time it was an in-person one. So now the recruiter could visibly see that this is a hijabi woman. And we've had Muslim women note that the interview was going great. They saw me, and then at the end they kind of asked, you're great for the job, you're a good fit, except would you be okay with perhaps removing that from your head, for example. And so we've had Muslim women kind of really question, what do I do in this situation? And so that would be a form of discrimination, right? So if you're being asked to remove your hijab, it's an important part of your identity. It's like asking a woman to remove a piece of clothing, right? And so you do have the right to wear a hijab. Regardless of whatever space you're in, you do have the right. There are some policies and practices at work. For example, some workplaces have a policy that say no headwear in the workplace, right? While this may seem like a very neutral policy, it would impact a Muslim woman or someone perhaps who wears a turban or a kippah differently, right? Because you're now asking someone to remove an important part of who they are. So in this case, your rights would be, you can ask for an accommodation, right? So you would put in a request. At NCCM, we have some fantastic resources. If you visit our website, we have a really great Know Your Rights guide. So if you have questions specific to, how to put in these requests, how to ask for an accommodation, what can I ask for an accommodation for, right? You can ask for prayer, you can ask for, if you want to take off for Hajj, etc. There's so many different things you can ask for. And again, you put in that request, and then if the employer denies it, the onus is then on them to prove why they denied it. So there's a legal test for undue hardship. And so they have to prove that they denied it because of cost, health, or safety. And if they can't, then you can take it further, right? And you can definitely contact NCCM if you feel like you're being discriminated against. But certainly, you have the right to wear the hijab. You have the right to freely practice your Muslim identity in Canada.
Thanks so much for that, Aasiyah. I really appreciate the in-depth explanation. And I'm gonna, Rania, Dr. Rania, I'm gonna, reach out to you now. Sometimes knowing our rights and maintaining strong emotional and mental resilience in spite of our environment sounds easier than it is. And I've been wearing hijab since I was 12, and I can tell you that there are days that I think about when we were going to work in the using public transit, and I would be at the top of the staircase before I go down to get the train. I look back, and I'm looking back for no other reason but to make sure that I'm okay before I go down the staircase. And I've been wearing hijab for a long time. Like, I've been wearing hijab since I was 12. So I think the piece that I'm looking for is, how do we maintain strong emotional and mental health and mental resilience in these environments? And at what point do we start to say, I recognize that this is taking a toll on me and I need to do something about it? What does that look like?
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Aasiyah. And it's always hard to be in that vulnerable place and to say, this is really what's happening with me. And so I appreciate that very much. And I can say to you that I would think that many Muslim women probably have had either a very similar story or continue to feel the same way on most days. You know what I mean? And so with that, I think it's very important to talk about how to keep up with that resiliency emotionally, even spiritually. And I think that's where, many people, it's not so much, like we said earlier, kind of debating, for many people, it's not debating the actual tenets of faith or the actual wanting to be a Muslim woman who is who's kind of like an observant and again, that emblem, right, of Islam as a Muslim woman. It's all of this other behind the scenes, right, kind of mental exercise that's happening about, am I safe? Am I not? Are my children safe? And so on and so forth. So first and foremost, and this is where I really appreciate Aasiyah's 6 Ds. I think they're really incredible, very nicely put. And in fact, one of my first things I was going to say is essentially to take action. And action shows up in many different ways. One is very much in the protective manner, right? So, choosing what you're going to say, what you're going to wear, where you're going to go, and being very much aware of your settings and surroundings at all times is part of that action. Is it exhausting? Yes. And after a while, you're so exhausted by it all that you maybe don't even know that you want to keep this up. I've met many a woman who is in that boat. But part of the keeping it up and being resilient through it is remembering some of the points that Aasiyah made, which is not only is this your right, and not only is it illegal to discriminate against you in so many ways, a reminder I've learned in writing that Islamophobia book is that any form of, these phobias or these anti, fill in the blank, right? Anti-Black, anti-Semitic, anti-fill in the blank, whatever it may be, it actually affects all of us, not just any single group of us. So as soon as that happens to our community, other communities who are marginalized are also feeling the brunt of it as well. So in part of resiliency is realizing you're not alone. You're part of a greater group of people who many of whom are feeling the same way. Sometimes they're even outside of your faith group or outside of your cultural language group, and they too are feeling the same way. So some amount of normalizing that's some of the work that we do with clients, is kind of just normalizing this, not because it should be like this, but because it is, unfortunately, at this moment in time. I think when people realize that it's not just them, it helps. And then from that point is taking action in terms of what you do, to protect yourself. So Aasiyah did a lovely job of that, so I'm not going to reiterate all of that, but I will speak of how do you protect yourself spiritually, right, in all of this, emotionally in all of this. So part of that is building that resiliency spiritual work, which for many, if you ask them what do they do, they'll say, or if you ask Wendy, let's say therapists or psychologists, counselors, what do they say to people to do? They'll say, meditate, find your safe space and your safe group of people to be with, and give yourself that grace, essentially, some of the language that's used in the field. I'd like to kind of give you the Muslim version of that, essentially, which is really, we have, of course, our own forms of meditation that are indigenous to Islamic practice. Part of that is really the 5 daily prayers, of course, but really beyond the prayers is also to take the time to really sit through and build up that spiritual resiliency. Right? Because if you are going to face the world, in our case here, we're discussing as Muslim women, and the topic today is about Muslim women. If you're going to face the world that is not very kind to you as a Muslim woman, you need that levels of resiliency, right? And that does come from a lot of internal practice, right? Internal discipline, internal practice of really connecting to your Lord, reminding yourself that there is someone always watching over you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that Allah is bigger than everything and everyone, right, that can harm you. And at the end of the day, no harm can actually come to you unless he's actually willed it to be that way. And in that case, right, is then, again, back to action of figuring out the next steps. Like, we don't just have an attack that's happened to us and just say, well, it happens to everybody, and not report, right? And not actually try to better the situation for the next person. So, but building, I find a lot of people kind of sometimes lose sight. They lose sight of, we read the Quran as Muslims. We learn about all of the stories in the Quran. We learn about Moses and Fir'aun, right, Pharaoh, and how he was so tyrannical over Sayyidina Musa and his people, right? But we forget that above every Pharaoh is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And we say this a lot, like, you have to remember as a person of faith that Allah ultimately is helping you and guiding you through this. And so building the resiliency spiritually is really important. Taking the actions that are needed and necessary, the 6 Ds, right? And then in addition to that, there's also the idea that, which is a point you brought up right now, Shaliza, like, if you've reached a point where you're saying, this is so taxing and so exhausting to me, what do I need to be doing? Then that, let me tell you, that is, you have reached a point where it would be helpful to get that professional intervention and help. So many people, back to mental health, right? They're kind of like, no, I don't want to have a mental health condition. I don't want to see a therapist because it means something is wrong with me, or I can do this alone. I don't need the support of someone else. I don't need somebody to hear, for many of us, we're cultured in a way, we're literally raised in a way in which our cultures have taught us you do not speak about your personal issues or family issues outside of the family, right? I think all of us have probably heard this concept of don't air your dirty laundry, right, to somebody, a stranger. And I would actually like to reframe all of that and say, no, in this case, when you have reached a point of exhaustion where you are considering, like the young girls Aasiyah was talking to, we're considering not wearing their headscarves anymore, or we're considering, for example, you've reached a point, like you're saying, Shaliza, you're looking behind your back, almost like which has become, unfortunately, it's a trauma. Like it literally is, you've experienced, it's a traumatic thing where you're being triggered every time you're going to that subway station, thinking and remembering either stories or even incidents that have happened to you. You keep getting triggered. That is psychological and emotional exhaustion that therapy can be very helpful for, not only to give you emotional resiliency, like techniques and what you need to do to really help yourself through it, but also realize if you're exhausted in that domain of your life, it's probably spreading in all the other domains too. So when you get home after work, or in Aasiyah's case, she was talking about when she was going to school and taking the public transport, and when you go home and start to snap at everyone there, right? It's not just because they're annoying you, it's because your bandwidth emotionally has been exhausted by having all these other aspects, right? So these are points where people sometimes don't realize you don't have to have a formal diagnosis of something to get help from a professional, from a counselor, from a therapist, right? So I urge this, and I want to destigmatize some of this. I don't want to seek out help. No, really, our tradition, our Islamic tradition, is to ask the people of knowledge when we do not know. That's directly from the Quran. That ayah is directly from the Quran, right? And in this case, these would be the professionals, right? So I really recommend that as well, and hope that helps shift this narrative and this discussion of what we should do when we're exhausted emotionally in this way.
Thanks so much for that, Dr. Rania. There's can't get my clock. Yeah, I think about it, and then I also think, personally, I've never experienced an act of violence, and I think about myself, and I say, well, I'm also, you've described an experience where I am exhausted, and then I think about so many other sisters who have, and I think about where they've reached in their in their exhaustion, and I listen to you, and I'm really just left to say that it's a tough place to be, right? It's a tough place to be in terms of accessing help. Nisa Helpline, we've been advocating for the need and the really pushing education around accessing long-term counseling, not long-term services, because we've been seeing that for a long time, that our community definitely needs to look at counseling as a support system, that we need to look at this as mental health is just like going to the doctor and getting your flu vaccine. We need to start to look and have very, very similar conversations. At the helpline, we're a peer counseling line. So, very often we would be faced with helping you identify where you're going to access that long-term care, and really giving you those referrals, directing you to where's next. And a lot of times we are faced with nobody's going to understand, I need a Muslim counselor, or I'm not going to go, or there are no Muslim counselors in specific areas. But again, it really just comes down to, are we standing strong on this is a need of our community, and really banding together to provide these services to our community. And mashallah, you have done an amazing work, even in terms of publications. I know we've used a lot of your work to really just to grow our insights. And we are so grateful that you share that with us. So I'm really looking to go into to wrap up. And why don't we go with Sister Aasiyah first? Is there any closing remarks, anything that you would like to share before we close off?
I think, mashallah, Dr. Awaad said it beautifully in terms of like a reminder, because, you know, things seem very difficult at times, right? There's Islamophobia, there's racism, sexism, and all these kind of intertwined depending on who you are, the identities that you have. But I think just kind of having that reminder in terms of that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always watching over you, right? And so I think that really is something to always keep in mind, and kind of destigmatizing what help looks like, specifically within our communities, I think is something that we really have to think a lot about. And I think, mashallah, Nisa Helpline is doing fantastic work. It's filling a huge gap alongside, mashallah, Dr. Awad's work. I think it's something that we need, right, as a community. Like I said, experiencing hate, experiencing intolerance, if you're not even a victim of it, if you haven't even experienced it directly, just being within kind of that environment impacts you. It impacts how you are able to kind of access services, spaces. It takes a toll on your mental health and well-being. And so I highly encourage folks to support NISA Helpline and see kind of mental health, well-being as something that's vital to our health and to the well-being of our communities, not just Muslim women, but for all of us.
Thank you, Aasiyah, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you taking the time to join this panel discussion. Dr. Rania, any closing remarks from you?
Really a thanks to Nisa, of course, Helpline, and also everyone, Aasiyah's work, and all the work that everyone really has been putting forward, and all the great discussion tonight. It's really my closing here remark would be a dua, a prayer, essentially for us all, because I think we really are all in this together, and I think there's so much shared experience in what is actually a difficult time. We hope, inshallah, in the future that that there is a better future essentially for our kids and our next kind of generations. And in many ways, I think the work that we're doing now is essentially paving that path, just like the people before us paved to allow us to be where we are today as, proud Muslims, unapologetic in many ways, right? Just really saying, this is my faith, this is who I am, this is my practice, this is who I'm choosing to be. And there will and needs to be space made for this, right? So after taking all of those steps, the rest, and this is what my teachers always remind me, and inshallah I'll share with all of you, the rest after that is like the hadith says of you tie your camel and then you tawakkul, or rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So sometimes we also are doing a lot of tying the camel, right? But we're not actually doing the second step of, remembering that there actually is a divine source and power that we believe in as Muslims, essentially, that is helping us through this. And with that is the dua, which is actually the prayers, and not to neglect or belittle the power of dua or prayer in all of this, including, because I know we said many things, unfortunately, I'm sure if I was listening on the other end of this talk, I think I would have walked away and say, oh my goodness, it's so difficult, to be, an observant, obvious kind of Muslim woman and have children who are raised as Muslim. I think that's how I would walk away today, subhanAllah. But here I want to just close it with reminders that, don't, after all that we've said of actual measures to take place, don't underestimate the power of dua, because at the end of the day, it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that's actually carrying us through and carrying our children through and allowing us to be able to feel that sense of safety. There are people, of course, in unsafe zones, we would call it unsafe areas, who in their hearts feel a sense of safety and therefore they're fine. And that's a gift that Allah gives, right? And so that's my prayer actually for all of the women here, and everybody and anybody who's actually listening through, and anybody who's marginalized in any way. This is the kind of prayer that I'm making in addition to the steps to be taken, inshallah.
Ameen. Dr. Rania, I truly appreciate you taking the time to connect with us and to share this with our viewers. Though, we talked a lot about the severity of the situation, I definitely feel you did an amazing job of reminding us and maintaining our uplifted spirits. So I hear you, but I feel our viewers are also really feeling really grounded, because I am feeling really grounded after listening to you, mashallah. Thank you so much for taking the time with us, viewers. Thank you for watching us tonight. Have a good night. Assalamu alaikum.